welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by one of my favorite return guests. I am always so happy when this name is in my inbox with a new book to talk about. And this one, I was just saying before we turned the recording on that this is my favorite book yet. It hits so many of my favorite creepy flavors in one place. All these great tastes that taste great together. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, I'm Maria Dong. I'm the author of Liar, Dreamer, Thief, Psychopomp, and my most recent book, which comes out in April. It's called AVIARY, and it's somewhere between a thriller and a horror novel. People are very divided on whether they should call it a thriller or a horror, and I'm just kind of letting them fight that out. About an undocumented woman who is living in South Korea, but is ethnically from North Korea, and discovers her sister's body along with a passport and a plane ticket and decides to take advantage of this situation to get out of her current situation, only to kind of stumble into a gothic human rights nightmare, I guess is the way to put that. So
Yeah.
it's funny because I knew I was going to be doing this and like didn't even think about, oh, how should I pitch the book? And this is actually the first interview I've done about the book. It's like we're starting the publicity cycle now, so I didn't have a pitch prepared, unfortunately. So work on that for next time.
Well, that was great. I really the Gothic human rights violation is pretty accurate, and it's also a great turn of phrase. Yeah, as I was saying before, this is not our first interview. It is, in fact, our third interview. So we're on our, Return of the Jedi, our Last Crusade.
Nice.
And I know that you introduced your novels before while you were introducing yourself, but just for our new listeners, could you remind them and me how you came to writing and sort of what led you to this project?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people that are writers, if you ask them, they have a very long story that starts when they're like 5. I have a bad memory. I do know that I probably did quite a bit of writing as a kid, but I think a really crucial moment was probably when I just finished graduate school. I went back to graduate school very old. I was the oldest among my peers for occupational therapy, and I was supposed to be studying for my boards. And at that time, I was like, okay, Maria, you're like 30 something years old. It's time to really buckle down and get like a real life and give up this whole like writing dream situation. And I said, okay, but what if one last shot? Because this contest came up across, like, I don't know, the algorithm brought it to me. It was called Pitch Wars. This was one of the very last years it ran. It ran for many years, but this was one of the very last years. And basically, you submitted a novel to the contest, and maybe about like 3% of the novels were chosen to be mentored. So they had authors and they had agents, and these people would take you on and kind of mentor you as to how to make the book. I want to say better, but I think more publishable is probably a better turn of phrase for it. And at the end, there's like an agent showcase. And you get connected with agents, you show them your project, and then a lot of people don't match with an agent in the showcase, so then they go off and they query the book. But a lot of like big novels in the last 10 years came out of this Pitch Wars contest. Like you'd be really surprised. Like a lot of really big bestsellers. I was not one of those, but I did wind up finding an agent, and so it was really funny because I think by that point I had written like a million words that I had, tried in some way or another to publish, either finding an agent or self-publishing or all sorts of stuff. And then this was kind of like, okay, universe, I'm going to do this one last time so that I don't have to study for my board exams, which I think made my husband very nervous. And I wound up getting into this contest, but I didn't find out about that until after I had passed my boards and I was actually working my first occupational therapy job. And so I remember like, I would drive to this. It was very far away. It was like 40 minutes away. And I would go first thing in the morning because OT, usually in like a nursing home, you have OT at like 6 in the morning. So I'd be up at like 4 in the morning. I'd be driving all the way to this place in the dark, in the cold. And I would stop at this coffee shop about halfway and get like coffee. And I remember opening my phone up and having all of these notifications like, oh my God, why haven't you said anything? And like, congratulations. And thinking like, what's happening? And then, of course, it turned out I had gotten into the contest. So I guess that was probably like the launch of my like truly professional writing career. Um, yeah, so that's how that started. And that book wound up not selling. It was actually about a like a zombie pandemic in Joseon Dynasty Korea. And this was before like there was this, Kingdom was huge on Netflix and everything. But we went on submission, and then right in the middle of that, the pandemic happened, and publishers were not super interested in books about pandemics, particularly like gory, horror-leaning, scary books about pandemics. Everyone was in a very scary place, and they were looking for a lot of like, hopeful, happy books, which I don't tend to write a lot of. So, yeah, that's kind of the story.
Wow, that is such an interesting story, and every time I hear it, I forget about Pitch Wars and remember
Yeah.
it again, which was such an interesting period of time, and it just, it was such a in retrospect, such a little flash in the pan, like this thing that happened for a little while and gave a lot of really great people, access to a bigger platform, which is really great. So, what was the inception point for this one? Was it a character or a scene, a mood?
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. It's a great question. The reason I'm laughing is because so as you know, it's a very serious horror kind of literary leaning. This book was originally inspired by an episode of 90 Day Fiancé. So I don't know if you're familiar with the show.
Yes.
Okay, great. Um, I'm assuming most listeners are as well, because I mean it's a phenomenon. But that's like such a crazy thing to say. But I really think that show is like it's like a little like universe, a little diorama of the universe of like particularly capitalism, right? Like there's so much in that show that's about like people that are like really, really in desperate financial straits or in bad emotional places. And they, a lot of times it's because of the capitalist machine. And then they get this idea that the deliverance from their situation will be this love that transcends, the globe, right? And a lot of times people lie quite a bit about their circumstances. They think, oh, we'll just get them here and we'll be in love and it'll be wonderful. So there's an episode of that show though. So that's why I'm addicted to the show. But there's an episode of that show in particular where there's like an old wife and a new wife. So the old wife is like, she and her husband got married really young and they like grew up together and they have like two kids or something like that together. And like at some point one day, they're like in their 40s or 50s and he wakes up and goes, I don't want to be married anymore. And he gets divorced or they get divorced and she's like really traumatized by the experience. And then he finds this new wife in, I think it's Brazil, somewhere in South America. And sorry, it's been like 5 years since I saw the show. And so the episode opens up with him talking about bringing her over and they're interviewing the old wife and she's like really nervous about it, right? And then the wives meet for the first time, and you can see them kind of have this like almost psychic understanding of like, oh, we married a dud, right? And then they kind of team up from there. Like they start doing like childcare together and chores together. And the old wife is like, I was really worried about this, but as it turns out, like it's been really helpful having someone around to do part of the parenting and stuff. And I was so like floored by that dynamic, right? And so the original conception of this book was about two wives. And obviously that's not what the book became. But that the component, like international component was there and there were like these two wives and and I didn't know where else to go with it at first. And so it took a really long time to percolate. I think out of all the things I've written, this one had the most drafts. It had the most like complete tear down, rebuild, start overs. It was it took me years to write this, even though I was working on it like every single day. So I finished it and sent it to the publisher of Liar, Dreamer, Thief before Liar, Dreamer, Thief even came out, which was I think in January of 23. And they didn't want to give me an answer on it until they saw like what Liar Dreamer Thief did, like if it sold really well or if it didn't sell so well. And also there are some events in the book that at the time felt like they related too much to current events. And now we are in a time where they relate so much more to current events. So they
Yeah.
were like, oh, this feels too ripped from the headlines. And I remember saying to my agent, like, when is there a time where like marginalized women are not being victimized by rich people? And at the time, Epstein had already happened, but it was kind of falling off the radar. And I was really mad about that. I was so mad about the fact that we knew about this thing, we found out about it, and then we just like I don't know, as a society, just kind of let it fade away. And if this, I mean, obviously now it's like less faded, but like at the time I was really mad about it. And then also the Atlanta spa shootings happened, and that was really, I remember like there's this naming convention that you really only see in Korean women of a certain age, kind of like people that were born in like the late 50s through the 60s and that like maybe the early 70s. And it's this like it's like it's a two-syllable name where the second name the syllable is ja. So you see a lot of like unjas, stuff like that. So my mom has that structure, and one of the women that was killed in that shooting also had that name structure. And I remember just like seeing an article about her and her life story, and it was like, oh my God, that could have been my mom. And just like really wrestling with like what it means to live in a society where like that's how we treat particularly like just women of color generally, but especially Asian women, like how they're sexualized, how a lot of men feel like they are owed something from them. And I don't know, like that kind of got all wrapped up in the 90 Day Fiance idea. And I just kept smashing more things into it just for like years. Every time something came across my brain that really like, grabbed me, I didn't know what to do with it exactly, but I knew it kind of fits somewhere in this book. And I would just start like making notes and shoving stuff in there.
No, that's fascinating though. And it is really interesting to hear that this has been percolating for quite a while because, while I was reading it, I was thinking that there is a certain ripped from the headlines feeliness about it just because of this being back in our landscape
Yeah.
again, with the news kind of finally paying attention again. But there is also like a timelessness to it, that is just as
Yeah.
prominent. So that's, I don't know. There it is both like perennial and extremely current at the same time. So,
Unfortunately, I think until our society massively changes, that will be the case always,
yeah.
right? Like really rich, usually men, usually white, are able to do things because of their proximity to power, and they choose the same victims over and over. If anything, like I feel like I didn't take it far enough in the book almost, but like I was really trying to weigh. So I'm sorry, I'm like dancing around because I don't want to give too much away. I was
Yeah.
trying to weigh, how much do I need in there to make my point and to make the story work and the text work without, dragging the entire book down. Does that make sense? Like, it's an important part of the book, but I didn't want it to be the whole book, obviously. So, yeah, but sometimes I look at it now and I think maybe I didn't go far enough because the reality, especially like as the Epstein situation continues to unfold, everything we learn is worse than the last thing, right? And it's like, oh, I didn't go far enough, right? But I didn't, yeah. So I don't know. But I wasn't trying to predict the future. I didn't think that this was going to happen. I didn't know it was for sure it was going to happen. I just, I was mad and I wrote all my mad, sad feelings into a book, and then I made the words kind of pretty so people would read it.
Wow. And so I'm trying to think of how to frame some of these questions in order to, to keep it nice and loose and not reveal too much. But I'm really interested in the dynamics that you were just discussing and
Mhm.
perhaps how they apply specifically to the international fellowship program that is kind of at the heart of this book too. So could you tell
Yeah,
us a little bit about the Petite Sea House in
yeah.
Pittsburgh? I'd love to know why Pittsburgh too, because I'm
Oh,
very curious about Pittsburgh.
well, I went to grad school in Pittsburgh,
Oh,
and I think one thing that was just so, I don't know, it made my artist brain just turn around and around and around is like the legacy of Pittsburgh and steel, right? Like it's such a visceral image when you like learn about the steel making process and what it looked like the way that this constant like melting fire process was running like 24/7, and just like basically like entire towns were like around this process, right? And so like there was so much money, and it was everything was so prosperous. And then because of international factors, actually, including like steel production overseas, it like all collapsed. And there was like this real economic devastation to that I think in a lot of ways, deeply evokes the Gothic generally, right? When we talk about the Gothic and you see like it's always about, historically the Gothic, you always see these like wealthy landed gentry kind of families that have these like crumbling estates, right? And it's so I think, in so many ways, it really just kind of evokes that. Also, the imagery of like trains and there are a lot of trains in this book. Some of them are real trains, some of them are hallucination trains, like there's just lots of trains. And I remember at one point the editor, who I loved the editor for this book, she was very like she didn't want to try to mess with my wording or my prose or whatever. She was very much like focused on like areas where like clarity kind of needed to happen or things were like maybe not moving fast enough. But at one point she was like, "Can we take some of these trains out?" And I was like, "Absolutely not." Like trains are very important to this story, both for like what they represent to culture, what they represent as an image, but also like the way that they have been movers of people across the globe. Often against people's will for like a very long time. One of the little side stories that's kind of mentioned in the book is the plight of Koreans in the Soviet Union and how people of Korean ethnicity, because of racism and because there was this worry that they were going to like outperform some of the white class, were like shipped on trains, out to like Kazakhstan and places like that, and a lot of them froze to death or starved at their arrival. They were shipped out in the middle of winter, and there was very little regard given toward their survival. And you actually still find communities of people of Korean descent in those places. And right now, it's of great interest to linguistics people, like scholars, because the version of the language that they have preserved culturally retains facets of the language as it was, in the 60s or the 50s versus because it hasn't had the chance to modernize along with, modern spoken Korean. So I was like obsessed with trains. Anyway, so Pittsburgh, the imagery of trains, the place that it kind of occupied as this like economic force that both rose and fell, particularly because of international factors. It's also like a place where there's a lot of innovation happening. Like it's if you go to Pittsburgh now, like people have this idea of it as it was like in the 60s or whatever. But some of the biggest players in Pittsburgh are healthcare players, robotics. Google has an office in Pittsburgh, so it's also this like very revitalized place. But then you go like 2 miles outside of the city center, and you're in those little kind of hamlet towns right around Pittsburgh, and it's like complete economic devastation in a lot of places. So it's also this place of contrast. So I was just very taken as an artist with it as a location. Does that make sense? And also the mountains, right? Like I live in a very flat place and just it evokes Korea in that way, right? Korea is completely mountainous. Pittsburgh's also very mountainous. And I don't know, there was a part of me that just really liked that, like the connection there, I don't know.
That's so interesting. And it's absolutely true. I think something in addition to all of like the economic factors that you're talking about, the landscape and all these things, like Pittsburgh also has a tradition of like of weird art
Yeah.
and like very eccentric wealth,
Yeah.
which
Yes.
sort of makes like Petite Sea House make a lot of sense there.
Yes, and it's funny because like there's a line somewhere in the book where I'm listing off architects essentially, and then again my editor was like, "Do we need like all of the arch?" I was like, "Yes, we do. Like you need to know about all of the crazy architects that were building these like you're right. It has to do with like money and culture. I mean, it was very culturally significant, in its day. It was like Boston or New York, Philadelphia, like so yeah, you had a lot of architectural investment there, and you see like there's so many cool, interesting, weird buildings. I mean, even walking around like the University of Pittsburgh campus, I don't know if you're familiar, but there's like a tower, and it's like full. There's like a tower full of like international rooms with like just all sorts of different. Each room is kind of just a different culture's art. They just I don't know they just wanted to do that I guess. There's a Kathy there's like Hogwarts. I don't want to call it Hogwarts because I'm like on the anti-Harry Potter kit, but
Yeah.
it's hard. It's so easy for a person to picture. Like there's
Yeah.
basically you walk inside the doors and there's like these big vaulted ceilings and all the wood and everything. And someone basically was just like, we really need like a Gothic castle here, and like they just decided that the center of this campus in Pittsburgh was like the place for it to be. So yes, I agree with you. And then also I think that my experience with my debut had me thinking a lot about the intersection of art and capitalism a lot too, and art as business, right? So because you're asking about the Petite Sea House and kind of this like artist's residency, and I think that like you know my experience as a debut, I can't complain because, I was supported by my publisher and a lot of people aren't. But it was really heartbreaking in a lot of ways. Like just watching something you had worked so hard on being reduced down to like the nuts and bolts of a product and how it was important to make that product appeal to as many people as possible. Like, I don't write for everybody. I write for like a specific, usually me, but like, a specific person, right? I'm trying to connect with, it's a very queer book. I'm trying to connect with queer people. There's queer longing and queer tension in it that doesn't necessarily appeal to straight people, right? Because we flirt differently. And so like, I think with my debut, having to kind of like commodify that artistic process, it really did a number on my soul. So I think I was thinking a lot about, artist product and what the art industry or literature or whatever, industry you want to pick that's artistic does to people, particularly marginalized people who don't have power or proximity power and money and, kind of the choices they have to make to be part of that. And yeah, so I think it was all, like I said, it was all souped together in there for a long time. So
Yeah. And, it got me thinking a lot about these sort of like incubator programs, and I'm
yeah.
sure that like many of them have done a lot of good stuff for a lot of people. But there is this weird tension between like nurturing and
Mhm.
exploitation, because in addition to like funding new voices and, highlighting new points of view and what have you, there's also the like, we need to make this foundation keep surviving forever. We need to like propagate our own existence. And so there's just something that makes it very complicated and potentially sinister before you even get to like, the gothic. So,
Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, I 100% agree. I'm so glad that came through because I definitely feel that way,
Mhm.
And again, like one of the interesting things that came out of Pitch, so I was in Pitch Wars, and then like the very next year, some controversy broke out inside of the organization, like inside of like with people that were part of Pitch Wars, not like necessarily the leaders, but like the participants. And it started all of these conversations, and then like within about I think 2 years after that, it ended. It had been going on for 10 years, and had been very successful, and I think probably quite lucrative for some of the authors that went through it and some of the agents and publishers that were able to kind of cherry pick out these like very commercial projects. But it was also this labor of love on the part of like the original founders. So it was like more work apparently than like a full-time job, and they weren't getting compensated for that. And then, then you had the mentors in the middle who I think sometimes we're approaching it from a labor of love, but I think also there's a lot of egos going around in the writing, world. Both people that I think a lot of it comes from insecurity, right? Like I can't think of other many more professions where you're so constantly like begging people to validate you, right? Where you completely live or die based on whether people like you and like what your work does, right? And so a lot of people were either, choosing to mentor because they thought it would help their, writing career, or they wanted to feel like they were, helping people that needed it, kind of, in a very breathy way. And so, like, there were some really complicated, and this is not a criticism of the program, by the way. I think this is like, it was a program that was very, very small when it started, and then it just started growing really, really quickly as it got to be successful. And I think it didn't have like a full plan of like what that looks like because as institutions grow, they have to start like operationalizing a lot of things like their values and eventually they have to start making some people unhappy. It's so it's really complicated. And so I think that's kind of like one of the things that happened here, but you know, it made me think a lot about like why people do art and why people want to mentor art or like again these programs how these mentorship programs, I guess, is like a good way to put it. And there are some mentorship programs. There's a problem with accessibility generally, right? Where lots of I'm in the SFF community, right? This is a thriller horror book, but I still see myself as a science fiction fantasy writer. I don't know how long I'm going to hold on to that image, but and like there are a lot of programs that I would have liked to be a part of. I would have loved to do Clarion or Odyssey or something, but I just could not afford it. First, I couldn't afford it financially, but then when I finally had some money, there was no way I could afford it time-wise, right?
Mhm.
Like my life, because of like the choices I made, yes, but also where I am on the privilege power ladder meant that I had to keep certain balls up in the air at all time, and that those didn't afford me to go to like a program like this. And so much of like the art and writing and film industries is making connections. It's who you know. It's like so yeah, it's a lot of and I don't know how to put that, but yeah. So yes, it's PTC House,
Yeah.
Pittsburgh Architecture and Art. Sorry.
And in terms of the group dynamics between the people who've been recruited for this program who are living in this house together making their art, I'm not going to make you introduce us to everybody, but I'd love to know like maybe the order of operations is the question I have. Like, did you settle on a group dynamic and then like break that apart into personalities, or did you create personalities and then just throw them together and shake the bag? Is that like a valid?
Yeah, I think it's a valid
Okay.
question. It's hard because again, there were so many drafts, and the drafts are
Mhm.
very different, and it took so long. A, I don't remember a lot of it, but also B, like it's like six different books in my head, right? Because of how much change happened. I think that like the relationship between the two main characters that have a relationship, I'll put it that way, that kind of emerged a little bit earlier, and it kind of formed like, the Ksenia is really like a change agent for Hee-Jin in a lot of ways, right? Like she doesn't quite understand the direction she's moving in until she has this other person show up, right? It kind of anchors her into where she is, and kind of starts to complicate her picture a little bit. So that relationship, I think, emerged fairly early, and so much of their relationship is based in like wanting, longing, desire, and when I say desire, I mean the positive aspects of it, but I also mean like hunger, consumption, wanting to like really absorb yourself in someone to the point where it like, just breaks you apart into like components. Like there's a dark side to that too, right? And I think that 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 hunger is kind of like a guiding light for many of the characters in the book, right? They all are somewhere on that hunger. I want to say line, but that's not
Yeah. Yeah.
spectrum. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So, and then Callie was really important. Callie's actually probably by far the most controversial character in the book. A lot of people hate Callie or just wish she wasn't in the book at all. And then other people, I think part of it is almost age. Like, I think people who are younger a lot of times don't like her. And I don't mean don't like her as in like she's a good person or a bad person. I just mean like they don't like her perspective being included.
Mm.
Whereas like sometimes older people that have read the book have kind of explained that they do like her character. I think that like you would not be able to I think that okay. One of the things that I researched and thought about a lot when I was writing this book was the concept of like a villain or a monster, right? And like specifically, like the difference between a monster and a like a quote unquote normal person. There's a lot of see, and I always like remember concepts, but then I don't remember the exact language around it, so it's not going to sound as smart as when, people usually talk about it. There's a lot of research that says it's extremely damaging for us to think of monsters as being separate from people. Like the people that do these horrible things, we have to believe in our heart of hearts that they're fundamentally different in some way from people like you or me, because otherwise it makes us feel sad and icky, right? But that's really dangerous for a society to do that because then you don't see monsters in your midst, essentially. Like you have to understand that a monster is just a normal person who has both motivation and access to do something not good, right? And so the main villain of the book, the main monster of the book, is someone who is actually in a lot of ways not that scary in the same way that the main villains of our lives right now, looking at the government, are like if you met some of these people in a restaurant, you would not be afraid of them. Some of them you would absolutely pity them, but it's like we, you know, because of their access to power And because they have the motivation to act on that access, they are able to do these terrible, terrible things, right? And that is, I think, also, what underpins like Epstein or any of these other situations. So, yeah, so Callie is the way that the reader has to actually understand the shape of the monster in the novel, right? Hee-Jin just shows up, and she also does not understand our culture very well. Like, she understands our culture mostly through the references she's had from like the internet and movies and comic books, but that's not the same thing as like being in a culture day to day. So without somebody kind of on the inside to really not only show you what it's like today, but also the history of how that monster kind of came to be and like the steps that monster took over the course of their monstrous evolution,
Mm.
it would be very easy to think the monster was like a monster and not just like a normal person doing bad things, which maybe is a spoiler, but I don't know. It's like a thesis of the book, so like it is what it is.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely valid to say. I don't think it spoils too much. And I think it's a really important point, this point about, that this drive to consider monsters as separate from us or as aberrations.
Yeah.
Because it does like two things. Once it makes us more comfortable because like it gives us that, imagined safety of like that couldn't be me or that couldn't be my loved one or,
Hmm.
what have you. But it also like shuts down understanding and it shuts
Yeah.
down us from figuring out how it happens. And I, sorry to Godwin this, but I remember like in high school learning about Hitler and,
Hmm.
and being taught to sort of resist that idea that he was an absolute aberration that came out of nowhere. There are real cultural forces and circumstances that make people like Hitler. And so,
Yeah.
I think it's an important point for the real world too. And likewise, I think something important that Callie does that I don't think is a spoiler, is that like complicity is also a spectrum.
Yes.
It's not like like resistance or complicity is not a flip, a switch that you flip. So
Yes. Yeah, I talk I t I have some writing friends that, I've talked through this book with for hours and hours and hours. I see if you're listening. And that was like another big piece of Callie's character, right? Is this idea of like, on one hand, it's possible that Callie could have made all of the events of the book not happen, right? But also, Callie is someone who has been trapped in some ways in a difficult situation for a very long time. And I didn't feel it was my place as the author to argue for or against her. I was just showing the complexity that is, I think, very realistic, right? For a lot of people that find themselves in proximity to monsters. I shouldn't say that because I just argued against the usage of the word, but like, you know, um, yes, yeah, exactly. Complicity, like that. And yeah, I was trying to not be too on the nose with it, but I probably failed because I felt very strongly about it. I'm sure it came across. So yeah,
But I feel like, the Gothic allows you like a certain amount of like expressionism,
yeah,
I guess,
yeah.
where I don't know. I think it's absolutely it works so well. And the mood is just so great for the whole thing, just full of dread.
Oh,
But then also these really like a lot of really beautiful moments too that I enjoy. Um
yeah.
I really love forgive me for saying this, like complicated female relationships, but I also just I love like a hot mess group, of like
Yeah.
of like like very very thorny personalities all together in a space and seeing what happens. And yeah, I just it's always lovely talking to you and reading your books. And thank you so much for coming back to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always extremely nice for me to talk to you as well. And hopefully one day we will have an occasion to talk in the future. You never know.
Yes, I hope so. All right, listeners, please check out the aviary. By the time that you hear this, it'll be out in the world. So head to your favorite bookstore or library or website. Do you have a favorite bookstore you like to send people to? This is a new question I ask.
I have a local bookstore that I really like. Is that okay? Yep. So there's actually it's two bookstores in one. It's like a children's bookstore called Bookbug, and then there's the adult side of it called This Is a Bookstore. That's the name. This is a bookstore. And it's just an absolutely like wonderful bookstore, and it's also functioning as like a wonderful third place for the community. They do tons of like community building events and consciousness raising talks and all sorts of stuff. So I love that place. If you're in the greater Kalamazoo area, I totally recommend checking out. It's just really wonderful, and they have like food and it's good, and they have like drinks and those are also good. So
That's so funny. I forgot that you were in Kalamazoo
Hmm.
until I was reading the book and you mentioned Bell's Beer. And I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot. And I spent like, when I was in grad school doing medieval history, I went to Kalamazoo every
Oh, of
single
course. If
year.
you do medieval history, you have to go to Western,
Yep.
right?
It's like
Like
our,
that is the place. Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
So-
It's funny finding that out as an adult because you're like, I didn't know I could have been nerding out about medieval history this whole time. Like, I didn't realize it was like the place. I have some friends who are scholars in Canada and they were like, oh yeah, we love Western. I was like, oh,
That's
okay.
so funny. I
Yeah.
was in a supermarket once there talking to just a resident, and he was like, I didn't think there were 15,000 medievalists in the world, much less like in Kalamazoo right now.
That's so
So
great.
yeah.
It reminds me, I got to check out their schedule for the year.
Yeah.
They might have
They
something
have
fun for me to, yeah,
good weird stuff sometimes. So
I
all right,
love it.
thank you for
Thank
indulging
you.
that aside.
Of
All right,
course. Of
and
course.
thank you listeners for joining us as always, and please do check out this book. This is one of my faves of the year so far. Okay, we'll see you next time. It's time to close this
Thanks.
chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.